This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's A-A-S-A, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. You can join ASA for only $60 Australian and they also have a concession rate of only $15 Australian. I also encourage you to follow them on social media. You can find them at ASA Australian Animal Studies Association on Facebook or at AASA_animals on Twitter. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. The series was founded back in 2013 and one title was released that year, Cane Toads, A Tale of Sugar, Politics and Flawed Science by Nigel Turvey. But there have been 4 books released already this year, which is testament to the growing scholarly interest in animal studies. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr Elan Abrell. Elan is a cultural anthropologist who is presently an adjunct instructor in animal studies and anthropology at New York University. Today, we're going to talk about his book Saving Animals, Multispecies Ecologies of Rescue and Care. This monograph, which is an ethnographic study exploring the ethical challenges experienced by animal sanctuaries in North America, was published by the University of Minnesota Press earlier this year. Welcome to the podcast, Elan.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to work on the topic of animal sanctuaries?
Yeah, when I was a graduate student in anthropology, which seems a long time ago now, but was only 5 years ago, longer when I started the project, I was kind of casting around for a research project to do my dissertation on and realized that I would really like to do something related to animals. I had not even considered it as like a possibly legitimate research topic. Right around that time, New York University had just started its animal studies concentration for undergrads, and some writings had come out in anthropology on multispecies ethnography from Eben Kirksey and Stefan Helmreich edited an issue that introduced the concept. And these things just kind of came together at a fortuitous moment. And I realized, this could totally be a legitimate topic. So then I started trying to think about what I would like to do in relation to animals. And I quickly realized that I don't think I had the stomach or the sort of like nerves to go into a situation in which animals are being mistreated. Like some of the great ethnographies that have come out in the last few years, like Timothy Pacharat's Every 12 Seconds and Alexander Blanchet's Porkopolis. And so I was thinking, well, where could I go and see people interacting with animals in a context that I wouldn't feel like I was sort of crawling out of my skin because I wanted to intervene and stop what was happening. And I settled on animal sanctuaries. So the initial question that I went into the project with was trying to think about what motivates people to care about animals. It seems like I know my experience with animal issues goes all the way back to when I was a teenager and I went vegan and got involved in animal rights. And I remember that sort of conversation topic I had with friends a lot over the years was like, well, what makes some people, like, what do you need to get people to care about animals? How do you convince people who aren't concerned about their choices? Sorry, my dog is growling in the background. What can you do to get people to care about animals? And so it seemed to me like maybe an interesting alternative or flip side to that question was, well, what motivates people who really do care about animals, who are already there in that regard? Sanctuaries seem like a perfect place to look for that because it's where people go, and spend their whole lives to actually care for animals on a daily basis. And as I started designing the research plan, I thought it would be interesting to look at different kinds of rescue work. So maybe if you hear the word sanctuary right now, the first thing that might come to mind for a lot of people is farmed animal sanctuaries, which I think is a very important part of the sanctuary movement, which I spend a lot of time looking at. But there are other kinds of rescue facilities. I found one way of thinking about the way they differ is the categories of use that humans put animals into. This isn't a perfect framework to map on to the way that sanctuaries are set up, but I found that you have sanctuaries for farmed animals that focus on caring for animals that are used in the food industry. There are sanctuaries for wildlife, captive wildlife, sometimes called exotic animals, which come from either the entertainment industry or the exotic pet trade. Different primates, tropical birds, and big cats, those kind of animals end up in similar spaces, like sort of exotic animal sanctuaries, you could say. And then companion animals was like sort of the other area of human use, or you could argue exploitation of animals, that has its own sort of arena of rescue and care. And so the third site that I looked at was a no-kill animal shelter or companion animal shelter. And as I started getting into the research and spending time at these places and volunteering and talking to people, I realized that there were a lot of interesting questions beyond what motivated people to get into the work in the first place. I also had a really strong interest in making animals an equal part of the research as much as I could. I don't have a background in ethology. I mean, I don't have formal training in that. So I wasn't going in expecting that I could necessarily interpret animal behavior or motivations in any kind of reliable way. But I did think that it would be really important if I were going to try to understand intersubjective relationships between humans and other animals, that I not make humans the only focus of the project and treat the animals as, like factors influencing the human experience, but instead subjects that are interacting with each other across species lines. And so to that point, early on in framing the project to get research funding, I found that way of describing the project in anthropology was not very persuasive to grant reviewers. I got comments back like, well, what about the humans? Like, why? This sounds like an animal rights activist trying to get some money to just go do animal rights activism, was a consistent theme in some of the feedback I got from grant rejections. So I reformulated the project to be more straightforward anthropology, asking about like the human factors and the cultural components of the project. But once I was on the ground and doing the research, I tried very much to treat all of the beings that I was working with as equal subjects who are affecting the dynamics, and to then understand the relationships and the dynamics of what it means to care for animals in these kind of settings, and what it means for the animals to be cared for as much as that can be understood. And so once I started doing that, it opened up all of these other interesting questions about the way that value frameworks affect decisions of care, and the way that animals can influence the conditions of their own care, and the way that the categorization of species around human uses ends up affecting all of these contexts of care within different kinds of sanctuaries because of the limited ability of veterinary care for certain species or food sources for certain species and so on. And so to look at all those bigger pictures, both the, as you said, the ethical conundrums that come up and dilemmas that need to be navigated, but also the pragmatic material constraints on trying to create these spaces of animal agency and animal freedom within a broader society that still largely treats animals as property and sources of value generation. And so that's going to be conflicting and putting limits on what sanctuaries can achieve.
Yeah, well, let's start then with those practical concerns, because one of the recurring issues in the book is the real difficulty of running an animal sanctuary, the real on-the-ground challenges, the risk of burnout, the fine line between an animal sanctuary manager and an animal hoarder, the risk of running out of money, and so on. So in chapter 2, for example, you repeat a joke from sanctuary workers about the Don't Start a Sanctuary conference.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this is a book that might discourage would-be sanctuary operators?
That is a good question. Would it discourage? I hope that it might very well. I mean, it depends on, it certainly, my research discouraged me from wanting to start a sanctuary. I should put it that way. But it wasn't because I thought, oh, this work is horrible and it shouldn't be done. It was because I think it's incredibly important work, and it requires a lot of dedication, awareness of the challenges, a plan for long-term resource access, and a certain amount of skill. So the joke about the Don't Start a Sanctuary conference comes from the Farm Sanctuary, which runs a conference, a care conference to train people who either are relatively new to doing sanctuary work, people who have started their own, people who are thinking about starting their own, basically anybody kind of starting out in the area, to get a really comprehensive overview of all of the challenges and considerations that go into the work. And I think the sort of truth to the joke is that you shouldn't start one unless you really understand this well and you're ready to do the work, because, like you said, there can be a fine line between a sanctuary operator and somebody who slips into becoming a hoarder. That line is determined by the quality of life of the animals in their care, including the structure of the spaces in which they're living, whatever form the captivity is taking. For safety reasons between humans and other animals, certain species are going to need something like a cage. A lot of sanctuary caregivers endeavor to make cages as little like cages as possible and as big as they can be, but they are enclosed, fenced-in spaces, like for primates, for example. Well, I don't want to suggest that all primates are in the same situation. There are sanctuaries, of course, totally focused on primate care for chimpanzees and other animals that have big open spaces that I wouldn't describe as cages at all. But places where I did field work, I saw the monkeys that had big enclosed spaces, but they had to be enclosed. They couldn't have free reign of the entire property. And so, there's a lot of considerations that need to go into providing proper care. And so I think my book hopefully outlines a lot of that and reports on some of what you could get from the CARE conference, although I wouldn't think of that chapter as a substitute for going to the CARE conference. If anybody's thinking of doing a sanctuary, I'd still heavily recommend going there. And I did see people the time that I was there from Canada, Australia, a lot of other parts of the world. It wasn't just people in the US. But yeah, I would say that there is unfortunately, endless supply of animals who could benefit from being in sanctuaries. Like the various industries that rely on animals are constantly producing new animals that are going to get killed for food or used in medical research or used in entertainment. And if they can somehow be rescued from or make their way out of those circuits of animal exploitation, sanctuaries would be a great place for them to go, given the alternative is being out in the wild, which a lot of animals can't do that have been caught up in captivity. We could start sanctuaries everywhere, and we still wouldn't be able to house enough of the animals that are being mistreated by humans in various contexts. But they need to operate in a way that can serve the animals' needs, or you're kind of just swapping one bad situation for another. So anybody who is casually thinking about sanctuaries, I would hope that the book emphasizes the importance of knowing what you're getting into, which I think is the theme of that conference.
And you touch upon some pretty foundational questions in that answer, questions that you address at both the start and the end of your book. Let me ask a two-part question, which might sound silly, but I hope you'll understand why I'm asking it. So number one, what is sanctuary? And number two, what's the point of sanctuaries?
Yes. So what is sanctuary? I do a little bit of etymological explanation of the origin of the idea as a place where sacred things are kept originally. And it goes back to in Europe, over the last millennia, you could get sanctuary in churches, and it was a sort of a religious concept. Somebody who is fleeing persecution or wanted for a crime possibly could ask for sanctuary and be protected in a church. And that's a similar meaning to what you can see in the sanctuary movement in the 80s in the United States. And then now there's a sort of a reblossoming of that in the new sanctuary movement in response to US policies around immigration, for example, like xenophobic, oppressive policies around immigration. So people have worked to get their cities to pass legislation to make cities sanctuary cities where they won't cooperate with federal immigration agents. And it's not a complete form of protection, but it's a limited form of protection in the sense that the cities are not agreeing to enforce these sort of repressive laws. But I think that the theme that I trace in that sort of other meanings of sanctuary that I see reflected in the animal sanctuary movement as well is essentially this political act of affording protection and care and support to beings that are vulnerable, that have been impacted by violence or exploitation. And I think that, although that looks very specific for animals, and there are different forms of violence and exploitation that are inflicted on humans by other humans, I see this cross thread of sanctuary as a political act across all these different sort of forms of oppression as a very meaningful political strategy that I don't know is being, and I'm not positioning myself as like the person to call this out. I think there's a lot of people who recognize this, and I'm just seeing the activists who are making these connections. But I see it as a very productive, possible political action that can be expanded to other spaces. It's like an ethos of care and mutual aid that can go across species lines, it can go across ethnicity lines or other politicized categories like race, gender, sexuality. And so I see animal sanctuaries as sort of really exemplary of this kind of political ethos in action. And so then that's also, I think, why they're important. I think maybe I was answering the second part of the question too, is I think, beyond just human interactions with other species, I think sanctuaries are important because I think they're really modeling ways of trying to do this work. And this goes back to some of what I was saying at the beginning too, as far as trying to do this work within a broader political economic context, like basically global capitalism, in which that's not the ethos that's driving the system. In fact, the ethos of global capitalism is essentially producing value at the expense of the well-being of the people who are making the value, whether those people are humans or non-humans. And so I see this as very much like a counter ethos to that, to instead prioritize supporting people and helping vulnerable people to thrive, whether, again, those people are humans or animals. For human treatment of animals, I also see sanctuaries as very important for modeling these different ways of living with and relating to and caring for animals. I don't think that we are on a trajectory towards a future where it's going to be tenable for us all to live and let live and leave other species alone and everybody to not interact. I see the sort of negative impacts that we're collectively all grouped under the Anthropocene, but that are human-driven, human industry-driven, whether it's environmental degradation, the extinction crisis, all of the damage to the oceans. I see it as pushing us towards a future in which it's going to be necessary for humans to coexist with other species in close proximity, at least for some species, if there's going to be coexistence. And so, hopefully we don't decimate the environment to the point where wildlife can't continue to thrive without any human involvement. But I think for a lot of species that have been either domesticated or tamed or put in captivity, we need these techniques and abilities and skills in order to live with them in a way that isn't exploitative and violent. And I think sanctuaries are doing the work of figuring that out. They're only a couple decades old as a concept. And I think in that time, you can see like really innovative work being done around inventing new veterinary medicine techniques and procedures and treatments for species that no humans were concerned with the aging process of industrialized chickens and cows, because before people started rescuing them, no industrialized chickens and cows were living past adolescence. And now they get to have longer lives if they're fortunate to end up in a sanctuary or with somebody else who's caring for them and allowing them to live out their lives. And so sanctuaries have done work around figuring out what kind of physiological problems that a geriatric chicken or cow might face later in life. And then what kind of and partnering with veterinary schools to come up with treatments for that. And so it's not just in the veterinary realm, it's in a lot of different realms, figuring out ways to create the best environments possible within the limitations of the space allowed and doing that kind of work. So I think in summation, I would say that sanctuaries are important both for what they can tell us about broader political action of affording support and care to people who are vulnerable, and also specifically showing and working through better ways to live with animals that we are already sharing spaces with. And I just wanted to address too, because I think there's a big critique of sanctuaries is that, it's not a very efficient use of resources, especially if you're thinking about it in terms of numbers of animals saved and versus numbers of animals killed by the various human industries that impact animals. It is not even a drop in the ocean. Because the scale of lives taken under industrial animal agriculture alone is in the billions or trillions if you count fish. And so sanctuaries can't even save a tiny fraction of a percent. However, as a cultural anthropologist, it's hard for me to not think that there's real value in the cultural work that sanctuaries do. And the sort of awareness, and this goes back to my original interest in sanctuaries too, of what motivates people to want to do this kind of care. The growing awareness that there are people who are dedicating their lives to this kind of care, who see it as worthy of doing, even if it can't change the bigger system, because these individual animals need somewhere to go and they deserve to have happy lives, I think is hard to quantify and measure, but I think plays a significant role in influencing the way people think about their relationships to animals. And so, in a dollar to live outcome kind of rubric, doesn't look like sanctuaries are having as big as an impact on things as perhaps forms of vegan advocacy might, although like that also is debated. But in terms of contributing to an example of an alternative world that we could have, I think that they're very important examples that can really influence the way that people think about how we should be relating to animals.
Now, before we move on to our regular questions, I really wanted to ask you about Chapter 4, Animal Death, because some of what you talk about there really stuck with me. So you introduced the idea of Necrocare. Could you explain what this is and how it operates at sanctuaries?
Yeah, so this is something that I realized as I was working with a coworker at one of the sanctuaries where I did field work, and he said something like, that I quote in the chapter, it's strange, but sanctuaries are really full of death. They're supposed to be these places to save animals and keep them alive, but there's actually a lot of death. And it seemed like a simple statement, just a descriptive statement about reality. But the more I thought about it, the more I started thinking about the like sort of profound dimensions of it. Because of course, at farmed animal sanctuaries, for example, literally all the animals can be kept alive on a totally plant-based diet. The death that you see occurring is the result largely of the fact that industrial animal agriculture has taken a real toll on animals' bodies, and some of them develop health problems early on because of this, and then they will need treatment and they might die fairly young, and so that's a common occurrence. But what my friend who was making this comment was referring to was practices of having to, which is something that this sanctuary happened to do, predator control plan that involved killing mongooses that would come into the sanctuary and potentially kill some of the birds and other animals that live there, and killing animals to feed to other animals. So there were a few raptors at this sanctuary that are carnivores and they live on a diet of just meat. And so they were fed mice and baby chicks that were killed quickly so that they wouldn't, have to experience getting killed by the raptors. But nonetheless, some form of meat needed to be fed to a lot of the animals that were carnivores. I didn't go to a sanctuary that has big cats, but this is obviously, you could guess, also an issue at those sanctuaries. Big cats are also carnivores. And so I started thinking about how death plays a role in care. And Tom Van Doren, an Australian author who's written about animal conservation, and especially in relation to birds, he wrote a book called Flightway. He has a concept of violent care, where he writes about, in whooping crane conservation, there are animals whose jobs it is to be sort of royal tasters of the feed to make sure there's no fungal contamination that can make the whooping crane sick. And I was thinking about that idea of having these sort of animals whose role it is to help out the care of other animals that end up not getting to be subjects of care. But then I started thinking about how specifically in the places where I was working, this actually meant animals dying. So I thought about this idea of necrocare, which is like the use of death to actually care for other animals, rather than, sort of necropower, which is use of death to manage populations, Akil Mbembe writes about. And so then I started trying to think about other contexts where this was happening. So it seems like it's fairly straightforward when animals are being killed for food, that their death is serving the care of other animals. But I was looking at sort of other contexts too, where like resource management can be something that ends up being a form of necrocare too. And I didn't actually see this happen at the sanctuaries where I was doing field work, but this is the kind of dilemma that a sanctuary might have to face. You have an animal in your care that is very sick with something potentially treatable, like, let's say, cancer. I met a goat who was, the caregivers at the sanctuary thought that he might have been the first goat to ever receive chemotherapy for cancer. Like, I think he might have had thyroid cancer. The goat that I met was able to get the treatment. I don't know if it was ultimately successful. But let's say that you're a sanctuary with less resources, and chemotherapy for your goat is going to be quite expensive. And that means that you're not going to be able to take in 3 other goats that year because you're not going to be budgeted for it. then you have to make a tough decision about, do you get care that you technically can afford? And of course, there are other considerations too, like the suffering that might put the goat through and the prognosis for recovery and these other things. But assuming there is a life-threatening condition that requires expensive treatment, but that also means that there's going to be multiple other animals that you can't save, I think that is sort of a more diffuse form of necrocare, given the fact that sanctuaries, like I said, have this sort of endless population of animals that they could rescue if they had the space and resources and human power to do the care. And so precisely because sanctuaries are these zones of care and limited animal freedom within much bigger system of animal exploitation and commodification, they have to make these decisions, some of which end up being life or death situations for potential others that could come in. And I think that that's something that also weighs heavily on caregivers. I think it's incredibly hard to have to say no to an animal. And that is something that comes with the discussion about, the idea of don't start a sanctuary or know what you're getting into, is that you're going to have to regularly say no, because people will call you and say, well, yeah, I just found this chicken or I just found this goat, and you're going to have already at your maximum capacity and know that taking in one more is going to be too much of a strain. And so you have to regularly say no. But I think, that's the kind of necrocare that I might see play out at a farm sanctuary, this more diffuse form. And then the kinds at sanctuaries that care for animals that need to eat other animals, there are these more direct versions where animals are either, being killed somewhere else and coming in the form of processed into animal feed, or they're literally being killed at the sanctuary and fed to the animals. Can I ask what you think about that? I'm very curious, since you've thought about it and written about it too.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm troubled by it. I'm inclined to think that we need to develop ways to feed animals, even carnivores, in ways that are not harmful to other animals. It strikes me that animals have rights not to be killed and not to be tortured and not to have all the awful things that happen to them when they're raised for meat happen to them. Whether or not they're being raised for human consumption, whether or not they're being raised for consumption by other animals. So I'm very excited about developments in areas like veterinary nutrition, where there are explorations of just how much it is the case that certain carnivorous animals may or may not need to eat animal products. So there's a lot of work, for example, on cats, because lots of people keep cats, and lots of cats are fed vegan diets, even if that's quite troubling to some people. And many of these cats do survive and flourish. So there's been a lot of research on that. But then I'm also very excited about developments in, for example, cellular agriculture, in vitro meat, because these open the possibility of producing meat to feed animals in ways that are at least more respectful to other animals. They raise the possibility of slaughter-free meat. They raise the possibility of meat without animal agriculture. And these could be ways that in the future we could feed animals on sanctuaries. Is this the sort of thing that, well, I realise, of course, that in vitro meat's a long way off, but did you encounter people who were concerned about the fact that they were killing some animals to feed others?
Yes, definitely. I don't think anybody that I met was able to do it lightly. I noticed that in situations where that's the case, where currently the animals that are being cared for in certain sanctuaries require eating meat, that the people the other volunteers and that I was working with felt very ambivalent about it, but were able to tell themselves, well, this is necessary for the care. And that essentially it became this sort of value framework in which not all animals get to be subjects of care of the sanctuary. Like, some have to be resources for others in order for it to work, in order for the ones who are getting care, who are carnivores, to be able to get that care. And that's very different than a situation like a farmed animal sanctuary, where every place that I've ever visited tries to do exactly what you just said, as far as treating all animals fairly and a right to not be killed and to be treated well. So they're not killing mice. They're not getting rid of pigeons that might be building nests in the barn. And of course, all the animals that are there don't need to eat meat. So it seems like, I hesitate to say it's a luxury, because I don't think that frames it in an accurate way. But it's a way in which the subjects of care of the sanctuary really make a difference in how much sanctuaries have the flexibility to not have to contend with certain ethical conundrums or dilemmas. because those carnivore sanctuaries or sanctuaries caring for carnivores can't decide. I mean, they have to decide to get rid of the carnivores if they don't want to have to like be bringing in meat.
Well, absolutely. And you say that there is this dilemma that they can't care for all animals at once. But then that just raises the question of how do they choose who to give care to? Why
Right.
is it that the predators win rather than, say, the mice?
Right. Yeah, that is a great question. I think, at least in what I've observed, and I don't think that this can necessarily be extrapolated to apply. I mean, I wouldn't try to apply this to everybody because there's lots of people who run sanctuaries that I haven't talked to. But I think it partly ends up getting decided by the institutional mission. So the sanctuary becomes a sanctuary for exotic animals, and then that becomes the category of subjects who get care. And then the other ones that need to be killed in order to feed them become the ones that need to get killed in order to feed them. And like, I don't mean to suggest in any way that this is like boils down to crass economics or anything, but I think that there's a real challenge to running sanctuaries that you need ongoing financial support. And so the mission can become locked in too. Once you become a sanctuary for exotic animals that need to eat meat, and people know that, and that's how you build your donor base, it might be quite a risk to suddenly decide that you're going to instead become, like, let's say a sanctuary I didn't do any work at, but that lots of people have probably heard of, is Carol Baskin's big cat sanctuary that was in the Tiger King, which everything I've ever heard about it is a great sanctuary. But they have a ton of big cats that they care for, and that's what they're known for, especially after that show. And I think it would be quite controversial to any donors that they have to decide that they were going to get rid of all the tigers. Where would they get rid of them to? And then decide that they were going to start caring for like herbivores instead, and like do a whole switch around. So I think like once somebody decides they're going to start a sanctuary for certain kinds of animals and they start doing that work, it kind of becomes, it goes on to like autopilot in a way. It's easy to continue to care for certain animals and to develop the framework of value about who gets care around the mission of the institution. But I think that you raise a really interesting point too about in vitro meat and cultural agriculture. I've done several years of research in that field as well, and that was like my project after animal sanctuaries. And one of the most common questions I've gotten anytime I've talked about it is, when is pet food going to be available? And that might be partly because I'm talking, when I do presentations on animal studies, I'm talking to largely vegan audiences or vegetarian audiences. So that's what we're all worried about, is what can we feed our animal friends at home, and not like how am I going to get access to it. But I think it's not something that gets a lot of attention around that technology, but I think it's a really important part of that, the potential that technology can give us in the future. There's reasons that it might be actually easier to produce that kind of food too, because there's a lot less technological challenges. You don't have to worry about making a steak. Certain species their tissue can be more easily cultivated, like insects are, in the scheme of other species, very easy to cultivate compared to some other stuff. And so if you have the right balance, I don't see why your cat can't have nice wet food of like cell cultured grasshoppers.
Absolutely. And if any listeners are interested in that topic, we had a podcast interview with Alice Oven a few months ago, and she was talking about this and her book, The Clean Pet Food Revolution. So this is a topic that's come up again and again on this podcast. In part, I have to confess, because it's a topic that fascinates me so much. Now, Elan, you are actually a returning guest to Knowing Animals, which means that you get the 4 quick questions, not the 5 quick questions that our guests are usually offered. So are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
Yes, I'm ready.
What's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of conducting animal studies research?
For me, it has definitely been the opportunity to work directly with animals. A lot of my fieldwork was just volunteering at sanctuaries, which mostly was cleaning up animal poop and mucking out barns and sometimes feeding animals, but just getting to be in the presence of so many different amazing animal people. Like, and I mean the animals, not the caregivers are great too, and I loved them, but to get to meet all of these different animals was really the best part of my research. Somebody once told me, well, if you're going to do field research, you should go somewhere tropical so you can hang out on the beach. And I think I basically did my version of that by like crafting a project where I got to spend a couple years just getting to know a bunch of animals.
And on the flip side, what's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of conducting animal studies research?
I would imagine this is an experience for a lot of people, at least the ones attracted to animal studies who are concerned with the treatment of animals, is that knowing that there's this immense system of animal violence and exploitation and death that is currently chugging along at full speed, and that there's not a lot we can personally do to change the velocity of that system or even like lessen its impact. So, seeing the animals who were fortunate to be in sanctuaries still have the marks of those industries on their bodies, on their psyches, was even in those spaces where we were away from it, it was still was echoed there and reflected there. And so that's probably the most disheartening, is knowing that in my lifetime, I don't expect to see that system ground to a halt.
Can you think of an animal studies scholar that you would like to make listeners aware of? So this could be an emerging scholar, a young academic. It could be someone who's written in the field but who hasn't received the attention you think that they deserve. It could be someone who publishes in a language other than English, or it could be someone in an allied discipline who maybe has been overlooked by animal studies scholar. It's just your chance to offer a shout out to someone that you think our listeners should be looking out for and should be reading.
Yeah, I have one person who I think is worth attention from everybody. A former student of mine named Nico Stubler, who has one article out right now in Critical Animal Studies, but I think is a very promising scholar who I expect to see some really interesting work from in the future, including a book that he's working on to outline a full proposal for banning meat at the municipal level and how that could work and what the impacts of it would be. So keep an ear out or eye out for his work as it comes along, because he's a great thinker about animal issues.
And are you optimistic about the future of human-non-human animal relationships?
I am, despite what I said about the disheartening parts of sanctuary work, and that I don't expect to see a sea change in my lifetime, at least not for the better. What I almost said was one of the best parts about doing this research, which isn't directly research related, but my sort of trajectory through academic stuff has enabled me to teach a lot of animal studies classes, which I am humongously grateful for, because there's nothing I like better than teaching these classes. And I've met several dozen, if not like a couple hundred students at this point in my classes who are really inspiring for the future. Like, I don't know that I would be this impassioned and committed to making a better place, and I don't, if I were their age and I saw what they're seeing, but sort of the hope and determination to be able to make the world better that I see in my students is really inspiring, and it gives me hope that there will be improvements in the future.
What are you working on next?
So currently I'm just getting off the ground on a project with Catherine Gillespie, who wrote the Cow with Ear Tag 1369, and we are, I hope it doesn't spoil it, but like we are planning to do a ethnographic research project on the rendering industry, which is this sort of big invisible industry that keeps all of the other animal industries running. Because if it didn't exist, we would be buried under animal bodies. But the rendering industry disposes of animal bodies and turns them into all kinds of other products. And so we want to explore that and look at all the dimensions of that.
And how can people find out more about your work?
You can follow me on Twitter at Elan Abrell, just first last name, where I'll share stuff. I don't have my own website, but I also do work with an organization called the Phoenix Zones Initiative at phoenixzonesinitiative.org. And I publish stuff in my role there and share it. They share stuff through social media when I publish things sometimes. So that's another way to find me. Also, you can just email me at ea101@nyu.edu or eabrell@wesleyan.edu.
Well, thanks so much, Elan, for joining us for this episode of Knowing Animals.
Thank you very much for having me. It was really fun.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And you can also follow me on Twitter. You can find me at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. And don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.